Our speaker today is Joshua Lollar in religious studies at KU. He is a scholar of Eastern Christianity with specific interest in Greek and Syriac patristics, Byzantine culture and theology, and modern Orthodox Christian thought. And his topic today is contemplation of nature in Eastern Christianity.
Great, thank you. It's very nice to get to share a bit of my research with all of you now that I've been sort of added to your ranks in the faculty. As he mentioned, I'm sort of a patristic scholar is my training, and in particular I'm interested in the intellectual culture of ancient Christianity, particularly ancient Greek Christianity, and its philosophical background, the way in which the early Christian fathers sort of received and shaped the general philosophical inheritance of antiquity. And within that, I'm most interested in the notion of how the fathers thought about the contemplation of nature, and how the contemplation of nature, the world, informs their understanding of theology and their practice of religion. This particular talk actually began as a part of a conference celebrating Joseph Wolodzki. So Eve has heard a bit of this, but we repeat things in the Orthodox Church, so Paki again and again. And as I was thinking about Wolodzki and how to think about the contemplation of nature with respect to him and his project, Wolodzki being one of the great monastic reformers of sort of, medieval Russia, great advocate of large-scale monastic possessions. And as I read his rule, I noticed how profoundly attentive he was to the environment of his monastery, to the kind of surround and the sense that the monks would have of what their surround was like, how that shaped their experience of spirituality. Make sure this is working. This is the first time I've ever used PowerPoint in my life, so I hope it works well. So just a couple of quotations from early on in his rule that kind of frame how I want to think about the environment for Christian reflection. He writes, "Let us be concerned first over physical elegance and good order, and then over internal observance." And then a bit later, referring to one of the Greek fathers, John Chrysostom, so 4th and early 5th century Greek father. "Let us be concerned first for the good order of sensations, and then for the good posture of the inner thoughts." So what you see here, Joseph is very aware of the importance of the external environment in framing the interior life of his monks. He, very interestingly, advocated that the monastery be extremely wealthy so that his monks could be poor, arguing that it's very difficult to acquire non-acquisitiveness when you're always worried about food and worried about shelter and so on. So Joseph was an environmentalist in this sense. He understood his role as the abbot as framing an environment that was suitable for his monks. So I want to begin with that kind of monastic notion, thinking about the monastery, but then from there thinking about the world as an enclosure, as a place where religious life and spiritual life is pursued. Now, in the modern intellectual reflection on Christianity and its relationship with nature, we often see that Christianity has a problem with nature. One of the most important sort of gestures, almost provocations on this point came when the historian Len White published a very famous and often cited essay in the journal Science called "Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis." And he basically indicts Western Christianity for the modern ecological crisis. The environment is in turmoil because of the intellectual framework of Christianity. And in particular, he argues that the very kind of practical orientation of Latin Christianity and its ideology of domineering nature, domineering creation for human benefit is what has allowed sort of the rapacity that modern human beings visit upon the natural world. Interesting that I'll come back to this. White sort of excerpts Eastern Christianity from this critique. He points out orthodoxy as being a style of Christianity that is very, very different. For him, the Byzantine world is contemplative, whereas the Latin world is active. The Byzantine world is aesthetic, liturgical, symbolic, whereas the Latin world is much more legalistic and practical. And he sees in that a possibility of kind of Christian intellectual culture being more positive towards the environment. I'll come back to that. I think his description it's facile in a certain sense, but this is more of an intervention as an article than anything else. And it's been extremely influential in how Christianity is thought about with respect to nature. Another example of this is in Pierre Hadot's book, The Veil of Isis. Hadot, of course, is very important scholar of ancient philosophy, especially ancient Hellenistic philosophy, in which he tries to define philosophy not so much as a doctrine, but as a way of life. And in his book on the history of the idea of nature, he also indicts Christianity with respect to the modern mechanistic, technocratic approach to the world. He says, it is correct to say that Christianity contributed to the development of the mechanistic representation of nature and to the desacralization of nature. From a Christian creationist perspective, nature is an object fashioned by an artisan who is distinct from her and transcends her. As God's work, she is no longer divine. There is no longer a divine presence in nature. So, on his reading, if there's no divine presence in nature, then human beings can do whatever they want with nature. Nature exists for the sake of human beings, and any mode of dealing with nature is therefore appropriate as long as it serves the ends of humanity. Now, part of my work is sort of to push against this, at least from the patristic point of view, and try to find different ways of thinking about this and to show and maybe maximize White's intuition about the possibilities in patristic and Byzantine Christianity as framing a different sense of what it means to be in the natural world. Initially, when you look at the contemplation of nature or sort of natural philosophy in the Greek fathers, it's sometimes taken that there's not much there, that the Greek fathers were not terribly interested in science, certainly, or even in cosmology as we would think about it. And one sort of choice quote that I like to bring up in this context is from a brief monograph from the mid of the last century called The Greek Patristic View of Nature. And this book is by no means, rigorous in the way that I would want it to be, but it indicates a general sense that you have amongst a number of people who study the early church, that the fathers had a fairly limited interest and limited grasp on the natural world, that they primarily were reading the natural world in a very childish way, as though they were writing children's books or something. Always with edification in view, the fathers of the church produce moralized and sometimes illustrated animal stories which exhibit no intelligent observation and are often childish to the verge of imbecility. Again, I will be pushing strongly against this, but it does indicate something that is true about the Greek fathers. They were not scientists for the most part, and they tended to read the natural world on the way to something else in their own understanding of religion. And I hope to explain sort of what that interval, what that transition is all about. Before I get into the Greek fathers, however, I want to take a look at a few different ways of thinking about the relationship between nature and Christianity. And in particular, the particular issue that Hadot brings up and that White brings up, the relationship between technology and nature and the way the Orthodox world might think about that. So here's a fairly long quotation. I just want to bring up the last bit of it from a 20th century Greek elder, Paisios, who's been added recently to the list of saints by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And he's thinking very typically about the beauty of the natural world. And I want to notice the sort of affective quality of what he's talking about here, and particularly how he thinks about what it means to have creation and a creator. Look at what God has created with just one word. Harmony, what variety. Wherever one turns, one sees the wisdom and the grandeur of God. So very straightforward. Look at the celestial lights, the stars, with what simplicity his divine hand has scattered them in the sky, without using a plumb line and level. They give such comfort to people, whereas man-made lights tire the eyes even though they are placed in regular distances. You see, trees planted by man in a forest resemble an army battalion, whereas natural forests, made of trees of different colors and sizes, comfort the human eye. Natural forests are so peaceful and restful. Some trees are small, others are big, and each one has its own color. One of God's small wild flowers has more grace than a pile of fake paper flowers. What I'm interested in this quotation is what we see in a much earlier Christian theologian, John of Scythopolis, that nature, rather than simply being the mechanistic product of an artisan, is rather the manifestation of divine art itself, that there's no interval between nature and art, between phusis and techne, in the Christian conception of creation. So to call the natural world an artifact of creation, this just is nature itself. So with that as a bit of a background, I want to look then at what the fathers do when they contemplate nature, and what they think they're doing when they contemplate nature. Ancient patristic philosophy, following the ancient schools of philosophy in general, like to sort of give a curriculum-style approach to thinking about the spiritual life or the philosophical life. To think about it in terms of stages, in terms of levels. And the typical framework for this is the threefold structure of philosophical life, beginning with ethical philosophy, praxis, asceticism, framing how a person lives. This then gives over into what they call theoria physici, the contemplation of nature, or natural philosophy, in which the changeability of the natural world is contemplated, studied, meditated upon in various ways. And then this contemplation of the natural world gives over into what is typically called mystical theology or theological philosophy, in which the wisdom of the Creator is sort of made clear on the basis of contemplating creation. Now, it's not as though you sort of do ethics and then you finish, then you go to contemplation of nature, and then you finish, and then you go to mystical theology and go on from there. It's a kind of mixed presentation, but the presumption is that a certain style of purification is required to see the world rightly, precisely because the world is changeable. And so much of the ascetical reflection of the Greek fathers has to do with acquiring a certain amount of intellectual stability in order to discern what is real in the flux of the world. The Greek fathers are very Platonic in the sense that they frame the desire for knowledge very much in terms of desire, affectivity. It is love ultimately that drives the desire to know, and in particular, the desire to know the natural world. Our mind cherishes, says Origen of Alexandria, 3rd century Greek theologian, our mind cherishes a natural and appropriate longing to know God's truth and to learn the causes of things. So thinking about causation in the natural world. And then the great 4th century ascetic and monastic philosopher Evagrius of Pontus, in his book on the Practicos, which is a kind of an introduction to ascetical life, writes, "The fear of God establishes faith, self-mastery establishes this fear, and endurance and hope make self-mastery unwavering. From these, dispassion is born." So this is the basic progression of ascetical attainment for the Greek fathers, acquiring enkratia, self-mastery, and endurance, and ultimately acquiring what they called apatheia, dispassion, which means primarily not that you don't feel anything, but rather that you are not swayed by external stimuli, that you have acquired freedom. with respect to your passions, that you use your passions rather than them using you. Apatheia then gives birth to love, and is this love that opens up knowledge of the natural world. So the ascetical life prepares an ascetic to learn the virtue of love, and it is love that then allows for knowledge of the natural world. And then this love-infused knowledge of the natural world gives over to theology. Now, within all of this, patristic Christology, that is the teaching about Christ as a theological concept, is very much bound up with their understanding of the contemplation of nature. The teaching of Christ just is this framework of ethical purification, contemplation of the world, and ultimately giving over that contemplation to theology. Many of the fathers took the 3 books of Solomon, the Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, and map it onto this threefold structure of spiritual attainment. So that the Proverbs, with their practical wisdom, are geared towards asceticism, praxis, ethical, virtuous purification. Ecclesiastes, which teaches the vanity of all things in the world, is linked to the contemplation of nature. And the ecclesiast, the preacher, the one who gathers the people to hear this teaching, is precisely Christ. So Christ becomes the place that the Greek fathers think about the natural world. In general, for ancient philosophy, natural philosophy was the place that structural logical causality, perhaps the divine for certain schools, and its relation to the material world are thought about together. Well, for the Greek fathers, of course, with their doctrine of the incarnation of the Word of God, this just becomes Christ. So to contemplate Christology in a patristic context is very much to do natural philosophy. And that's how I want to look at it here. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about the figure I study most directly, Maximus the Confessor, who is a 7th century monastic philosopher and theologian, controversialist later in his career. He is a kind of culmination of Greek patristic thinking on the one hand, and as a foundation for the Byzantine theological world on the other. One of the most significant figures in Byzantine Christianity. And in his text, The Ambiguity of John, which is a long treatise of sort of speculative scholia on an earlier Greek father, he spends a lot of time reflecting upon the contemplation of nature and how it relates to his ultimate goal, which is to describe human union with the divine, the Greek concept of theosis, where human beings partake of divine reality in a radically profound way. Towards the end of his text, he gives a long meditation about the nature of the created world and how the created world relates to its divine cause. And on the one hand, it's a very kind of Neoplatonically inflected approach to this question. He sees the process of creation as God, to about halfway down the quotation there, sowing his own goodness in beings like seeds until the completion of all the ages, when he will gather the fruits of his seed unmixed with weeds and pure of chaff-like residue and anything else that might be mixed in. And the whole logos, the whole rationale, the whole structure of the motion of things will be completed. For those who are worthy will have received the final blessedness of deification, theosis, coming to partake of divine reality. So creation for Maximus is not so much God as an artisan. It is rather God as a farmer, but not as a farmer who sows seeds that are other than himself. The seeds of creation for Maximus are what he refers to as the logi ton onton, the ideas or sort of structural, rational principles of what exists. And these reside, as they did for Philo, for Clement of Alexandria, early fathers, in the mind of God from all eternity. So there's a very real sense in which God just is planting himself in and as the world. Now Maximus makes a distinction between the creator and the creation, but he has to do it verbally because you might take the opposite view. This is a very strongly Neoplatonic, certainly, quote, panentheistic approach to the world, almost tending towards pantheism in a certain sense. This, of course, would be heretical for an Orthodox Christian, so he has to make the distinction. But the point is that the end of human spiritual attainment to participate in divine life is the beginning of creation, because God, on his reading, has implanted his own goodness, his own virtue in the natural world. And this is then taken up by Maximus in a kind of liturgical imagination. So if the process of God sowing his goodness into the natural world is the process of making creation, the harvesting of it, the gathering it together, the fashioning it into bread, and the partaking of it, for any traditional Christian, this just sounds like the liturgy. This just sounds like the Eucharist. And Maximus is very attentive to these kind of liturgical cycles that you would see in the natural world. So the grain is ripened and made edible for God the Father, as though the Eucharist is being offered in a way. Maximus also talks about the partaking of the Passover sacrifice as being an image, a similar image of partaking of the divine, specifically in the Eucharist, in the body and blood of Christ. So this sort of central Christian act of liturgy for Maximus is taken as a kind of recapitulation of the cosmic process of creation itself. Now, there's a long history of this style of reflection in the Greek biblical world. Philo of Alexandria, for example, gives an allegorical interpretation of the temple, in which the whole of the temple is taken as a kind of cosmos, with the altar as the earth, and the candlestand, and the other altars, and the ark, and so on, framing the different celestial spheres. And so the process of worshiping God is a kind of enactment of the cosmic process. It's an enactment of cosmic contemplation. Some of the Greek fathers took this up. Clement of Alexandria, notably, argued that Moses was physikos. He was a physical, natural philosopher. And what he taught Israel was precisely the nature of the cosmos. And it's lodged most profoundly in the ritual acts of the temple. Maximus sort of takes up this tradition, and the whole framework of Byzantine liturgy, in a way, recapitulates this kind of cosmic approach to understanding worship and liturgy. This is what I think White was getting at when he talks about Eastern Christianity being aesthetic and symbolic in its approach to the natural world. So that's one structure, you could say, of the Eastern Christian experience of being in the natural world. It is utterly liturgical in its presentation. Another very important aspect is thinking of the world as a school, as a place for pedagogy. Many of the Greek fathers very naturally took over the traditional approach to paideia in the ancient Greek world, formation, the acquisition of intellectual culture, and applied it to Christian teaching. And the world was seen as a place where the human being learns how to live, learns about reality in a kind of almost controlled environment. Because again, for the Greek fathers, the really real is transcendent, is the beyond. This world is a classroom. So God becomes a teacher. Christ becomes an instructor, a wise sage. With respect to the contemplation of nature of the world, many of the Greek fathers were actually quite skeptical of human ability really to give a rigorous account of the natural world. They understood the world to be very much like the scriptures themselves. Nature becomes a book. And just like the Bible, for a theologian, the world, for a natural philosopher, is a place of mysteries. It is a place that requires deep engagement to try to get at the mystery that is hidden within things. So a good example of this is Gregory of Nyssa's text, in which he is defending his brother's homilies on the 6 days of creation. And he's been doing a lot of speculation on his interpretation of the first chapter of Genesis. And he says, "We freely admit that we are giving only our own views on the ideas that are before us as a sort of exercise. We are by no means setting down a fully explanatory teaching in what follows. So when I weave together unconventional ideas with the starting points that are available to us from Holy Scripture and from what we learned while sitting at the feet of our teacher, Basil, his brother, let no one question my discourse, for it is not my task to contrive some sort of justification for the obstacles that seem to be at hand, but let me be granted the authority to scrutinize the meaning of the words in accordance with their own purpose. If somehow it should be possible for me, with the help of God, to put together a coherent and consistent study of the creation, a theoria, of what has come into being in such a way that my speech remains consistent with how Scripture's meaning appears to us. Discourse on the natural world is an exercise. It is an essay. It is a work that is there to teach the contemplator, but not necessarily to give actually a rigorous account. And while Gregory thought that in fact the natural world and the human mind are perfectly fit to one another, the mind has diverse senses, diverse ways of thinking, it is therefore perfectly suited to intuit the multiplicity of the world, he also claimed that the human mind can't know the essence really of anything, certainly not of itself, and not of the natural world either. And so their approach to thinking about the natural world is precisely pedagogical, symbolic, and ultimately, for them as well, liturgical. To come back to Maximus, it is also somewhat playful. Maximus thinks about human beings being in the world as a classroom like little children in a preschool room with God as the parent or as the teacher who brings before them beautiful things to get their attention, to teach them the rudiments of how to speak, how to manipulate their hands and so on. But it's a kind of a game to draw them towards higher things. And after they acquire the basic words for things, the basic understanding of things, then they are passed on to something higher. He's been reflecting upon a quotation from a 4th century father, Gregory the theologian, where he talks about the word playing in the natural world. And this doesn't sound appropriate for the divine. How could the divine play games? But this notion of God playing with human beings the way a teacher plays with a child to instruct it is what he's getting at here. So even the highest notions of logic, which Maximus goes into great detail about, all of these things compared to what they're really after appears to be a game. Not an unreal game. It is a game about what actually exists, but still it is something of a pedagogical game. Thirdly, and to return back to the liturgical notion, ultimately for the Greek fathers, the natural world just is the manifestation of the divine presence itself. Gregory the theologian, in one of his orations, talks about the famous passage in the book of Exodus where Moses asks God to see God's face. And God says, well, no one can see my face and live, but I will show you my back. And so, as the narrative puts it, God sets Moses on the cleft of a rock, walks by, covers him with his hand, and then goes by, and Moses is able to see the back of God. Gregory says the back of God is the created world. Very, very striking, I think, image for that. Basil, as well, has a very strong sense of the sacred presence of or the sacred presence in the natural world. And it is for this reason that he's actually not someone who pries into the cause of things, who pries into the essences of things, but rather, interestingly, prefers to stay on the surface of the created world. He says, let us resolve with respect to the things on earth. This is in his first homily on the 6 days of creation, which he gave to a mixed audience. learned people, common people, children, all there to hear him preach about the 6 days of creation. Let us resolve not to busy ourselves with trying to define the earth's essence or to wear out our capacity for thinking by seeking out its underlying substance. Neither let us seek out any nature devoid of all qualities and existing completely unqualified in its own principle. Rather, let us be well aware that all the things we see surrounding a particular reality are employed when we give an account of that thing's being and complete its essence. If you try to remove with reason each reality from the qualities that are inherent to it, you will come up with nothing in the end, like peeling an onion. For if you should set aside black, cold, weight, thickness, its qualities pertaining to taste, or anything else like these that we see to pertain to it, then there will be no longer any underlying substance left. For Basil, it is the central manifestation of something that is most profound in it. And it accounts for how he prefers biblical descriptions of the natural world than scientific ones. For example, he talks about the clouds in the sky being parted like a curtain. Now, obviously, it's not a curtain, and any scientist is going to talk about, water vapor and so on. But Basil says it's more accurate to talk about it like a curtain because that's what it looks like to us. It's much more interesting and profound to a human being to use this kind of poetic image than to give a scientific description. It frames our experience more deeply, he would argue, and certainly more piously. So there's a kind of program of moving away from a more abstract and scientific description because things do not give themselves to us in that way. They do not present themselves as mathematical abstractions. They present themselves as things with weight, with color, and with size. Last patristic source here to kind of bottom this out. Dionysius the Areopagite, 6th century probably, anonymous church father who presents himself as being the disciple of St. Paul, from the book of Acts, wrote in his Divine Names, which is a treatise discussing all the different ways the Bible talks about God, all the different words the Bible uses in relation to the divine. And he culminates his discussion, his introduction to this text, by identifying God with everything in the world that is used to name him. He is intellect, soul, body, heaven, earth. His own self-identity, he is at once within the cosmos, the enclosure of the cosmos, beyond heaven, beyond being. He is sun, star, fire, water, wind, dew, cloud, cornerstone, rock. He is all things and not one being among other beings. So you see, this is sort of the culmination of this reflection of, on the one hand, utterly identifying the divine presence with the created world, but on the other hand, acknowledging its radical difference. And Greek patristic thinking sits down in this tension between an intensely profound experience of divine presence in the natural world and the sort of theological conviction that God is yet beyond the natural world. Now, one place we see this very interestingly in the modern world is in the work of the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew, the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Patriarchate of Constantinople took it upon itself 30 or so years ago to sort of become the patron episcopal see of the natural world. And Bartholomew's successor began this project, and then Bartholomew has very much inhabited it, taking his role as the ecumenical patriarch, a word that means the patriarch for the inhabited world, to be an advocate for ecology. So many people who work in the intersection between religion and ecology know about Bartholomew. Not so much about orthodoxy in general, but they know that he is one of the great religious advocates of kind of ecological awareness. And he uses very strong language to talk about how the Orthodox Church and how human beings in general should be towards the natural world. This first quotation sort of gathers what I was talking about with respect to the Father's liturgical or Eucharistic approach to the natural world. This is him giving a public address. The significance of the Eucharistic and ascetic ethos of our tradition, the Orthodox tradition, that manifests our most important and most crucial, unique contribution toward the proper and universal struggle for the protection of the natural environment as a divine creation and shared inheritance. So his understanding of the Orthodox way of life, liturgy, Eucharist, ascetical practice, is precisely what the Orthodox Church can sort of give to the modern conscience of the natural world. An ascetical ethos, an ethos of liturgy, thanksgiving, symbolical understanding, would frame a different approach to the natural world. And then secondly, and very strikingly, the use of the world and the enjoyment of material goods must be Eucharistic, that is, bound up to thanksgiving, gratitude, accompanied by doxology, praise towards God. By the same token, the abuse of the world and participation therein without reference to God is sinful, both before the Creator and before humanity as creation. Bartholomew is very willing to use the language of sinfulness with respect to pollution. It is a moral failing and ultimately a theological failing for him. And so I see in Bartholomew a kind of practical manifestation of this deep structure of Greek patristic reflection on the natural world. I guess I'll go ahead and stop there and see if there are any questions or comments that you might have about any of this material. Thank you.